Hello, my name is Karen Curry, and I'm on the board of directors of American Insight. Today, we're going to talk about one of the 2023 official selection films, With This Breath I Fly. This tells the extraordinary story of two heroic Afghan women, Gulnaz, who was impregnated by her uncle after being raped, and Farida, who took to the run after her abusive husband spent years inflicting violence on her.
Half the women behind bars in Afghanistan have been jailed for so-called moral crimes.
Now to an act of desperation by a woman faced with an impossible choice.
She was sentenced to 12 years in jail.
And you may have a hard time believing just why she was sent there.
हमारा कश के बेन उता हमारा अंदा बच्ची के दस्ती पाई हमारा बस्ता का माँ बच्चे का मुझे बाबा बुराई जाको दफ्तर हमें खबर को हमारे खबर
یک وقتی بود این مرد شوهر مرا گیر کرد که به زد کلی همسایه آمد سرم امروز یک از بغلان یک بچگک است باز ده این بچه گفتم که بیا مقدت میرم
طبعا هم توجید کرده دیگه میرم که از مرا گیر نمیکنه اکسو خیسته میرم از بالا بیغم میشیم گفته بوده دیگه او را خود نشد زنده بودم در جان مرده بود دیگه مخت
خانمش پشت دیوار است مدهی پشت دیوار دمه بسیار رنگ میبرم من
قارد باشه اون در جان مرده است دیگه
To her, there's only one way out. A dreadful choice.
Spend the next dozen years in prison or agree to marry the man who raped her.
من از این خوشند هستم که ای از نجات یافتم از چنگال شوهرمشان در قسمتم بود یک سال پورا تیر کردم حالا مجبور هستم مقید پورا تیر نکنم خوب است برای چه کنم زندگی خراب شد
شما پیشدنی نیستم که مثلا به خاطر 20 سال زندانم تیر کنم شما که سر من استاد هستین
The same two women, unbelievably, were charged with so-called moral crimes brought within the same Afghan justice system that had received billions of dollars of aid from the European Union. Ironically, it was the EU who commissioned the project, wanting to take a look at women's rights in Afghanistan. But when the filmmakers came to them with what they found, the EU tried to shut it down. That caused a furor within the international press, and the coverage that followed is probably the reason that we're here today talking about the film. This is a story of two women who would just not remain silent. And that, along with the commitment of the filmmakers, allowed them to shine a damning light on a justice system that actually punishes women for the injustices that are committed against him. Sam French is one of the directors on the film, and he joins us today. Sam lived for many years in Afghanistan, starting the Afghan Film Project, and he was nominated for an Academy Award for another film he made in Afghanistan called the Buzkashi Boys. I'd like to welcome Sam French. Hello, Sam.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for having me today.
Great to see you, and congratulations on an extraordinary film.
Thank you.
We spoke a while back, and you were very keen that everybody understand that this was not something you did alone, that you had an extraordinary team, and a team that was a female team. So tell us a little about the team and why it was so important that they were women.
Thank you so much for asking that question right off, because I think it's really important. This film is about women, and it shines a light on the injustices committed against women. And the theme of the film is to amplify women's voices. And we made the film in 2010. We started filming, and I was approached by two very good friends in Afghanistan. I was living there at the time, Leslie Knott and Clementine Malpass, and we applied to a contract with the European Union to make a film about women's rights. And we built a team in Afghanistan, a very small team. It was me, Leslie Clem, and our associate producer Farzana Wahidi. who was the first female photographer in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban in 2001. So I'm sitting here today as a white man, having lived in Afghanistan for 5 years and cared deeply about women's rights. But my job throughout the production of the film was to support the incredible women working on the project. It was Leslie and Clem who went into the prisons every single day to interview these women and craft this incredible story. And, we produced the film through my company. And I'm sitting here today because we all came together over the course of the past dozen years to make sure that these two stories of these two women are told.
And these two women are absolutely extraordinary. What I love the beginning of the film, where you focus on Farida in prison, and you think of a woman in prison and horrible, dejected. She's a beautiful woman. She was putting on makeup with the other women who were with her. It showed how people try to normalize the situation they're in. And I thought it was a really wonderful way to start the film, to show the humanity of this woman who was so falsely imprisoned. Tell me why you decided to start with that.
Yeah, so when you're editing a documentary, you're constantly moving scenes around and trying to figure out how to tell the story in the best possible way and stay true to these women's experiences. We have a great responsibility to paint them in the light that they really live and want to be perceived as, not our perceptions of them. And in Afghanistan, women don't have much freedom. But like everywhere, everyone wants to look and feel beautiful. And so even in prison, these women would have little parties and put makeup on and hang out with themselves. The other thing that we didn't show as much in the film, but is very present in the prisons, we just didn't have time for the storyline, is that there are lots of kids in prison, children, because of course men can't raise children in Afghanistan. So if a woman is imprisoned in Afghanistan, the children often go with her and are raised inside the prison. So that domestic life, I think, is really important for the women in prison, and that sense of community. So we really wanted to highlight that at the beginning. There's kids around, there's women, they're all laughing and joking and putting makeup on. And we want to highlight that humanity right off, because this film is not about us looking at these Afghan women saying, oh, what poor oppressed women. Which is true. Women are oppressed in Afghanistan. That is the number one thing we should come away with here. But also that they are incredibly courageous, incredibly strong, incredibly human. And we wanted to show the film through their eyes, not through our perspective. So that's why I decided in the editing room, pretty much at the very last editing session, to put that scene first, because it really shows that we're going to see a film through the eyes of these two women. And Farida's intro there, I think, really shows her character and her smile in the face of the incredible injustices she's suffered. And I hope that we like her right off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely do. It's fascinating, and I'm sure it's because you lived in Afghanistan and you weren't living in a gated community with a bunch of expats, playing bridge. You were actually living in Afghanistan and grew to know the Afghan people. And I'm sure for you, it was important, even though much of what we saw and heard was kind of startling, to not otherize the Afghan people. And even though the ways in which some of these, family members were treating their daughters or sisters was kind of horrifying, I didn't feel that it was exploitative in any way. I just thought this is a complicated culture. I'm talking too much. So you tell me how you went about doing that. Yeah.
Well, first of all, we did actually start a bridge club in Afghanistan. So I do play bridge. But no, I think when a lot of people think of Afghanistan, they think of, barbed wire and concrete blast walls and women in burqas and, shooting battles in the streets, all of which are present. But it's also a country full of humor and art and literature and love and connection. And the Afghan people are incredible. And that's why I stayed for 5 years. I got there in 2008, and there was an incredibly thriving expatriate community. But the Afghan people were incredibly welcoming and hospitable and generous to me as a foreigner. And so, I lived in a little house in a little quiet neighborhood. I had 2 dogs. I had a couple roommates, and I had Afghan neighbors. And, my life was full of hanging out with my Afghan friends as well as my foreign friends. So I really, when I was looking at the news coverage of Afghanistan, and I did some news coverage when I first got there, I was frustrated because the Afghanistan I saw was not what I saw reflected on the news. So my overriding mission throughout my work has been, especially also with Buzkashi Boys, my first film that was nominated for an Academy Award, was just to show a portrait of regular Afghans living their lives and achieving and struggling for their own dreams through their eyes. And so I think that's really important. And also, as a documentary filmmaker, it's really important. One of the things I've learned, I'm a verite filmmaker, so I like to do fly on the wall filmmaking in the great grand documentary tradition, and that is, ethnographic for sure. But one of the things that we need to do is take our perspective and really challenge our perspective. So really just point the camera and amplify the voices and let them speak of the people that you're making the film with, right? And even if they're voices you disagree with. So we interview in the film, we interview Gulnaz's uncle, and we interview Farida's husband, and not interview, the lawyer goes and talks to Farida's husband. It's a verite conversation, just natural conversation. We talk to the prosecutors of the case. We have the lawyers lead us through, the charges and how they're fighting them in court. And all of those things, we try to keep our camera just in the background, just observing and letting people speak, and allowing a safe space, even for people we disagree with, to express what they feel and think. And I think that's a way we can let the audience decide for themselves what they believe, who they trust, rather than having me as a filmmaker say women's crimes against women, moral crimes, women are terrible, women's rights should be respected. No one wants to hear that from me. We want to see the actual lived experience. So that's the goal, and I hope we succeeded in a small way in this film.
I think we did for sure. Now, how did you decide it was going to be Gulnaz and Farida as the 2 main characters? I mean, people don't talk about casting when they think about documentaries, but it is a casting decision because they are going to be the most able to illustrate the story. So how did you know they were the 2?
Yeah. Casting is the most important thing in documentary. And, I truly believe that everybody has a story that can be told. The question is whether they're ready to tell it, and whether we can create a space in which that story can unfold over the course of a film in front of a camera. So Gulnaz and Farida are incredible women. And my co-director Clementine Malpass, and our producer Leslie Knott, along with Farzana Wahidi, our associate producer, these 3 incredible women, would go into the prisons for weeks and weeks and weeks and interview women, and multiple women, dozens of women, and hear their stories. And it's important to understand that the 2 women we feature in the film are just representative of thousands of women that at the time were in prison for moral crimes. And it's even worse now. I mean, 1,000 times worse now under the Taliban. And we probably wouldn't be able to do this film now. So they interviewed all these women, and every one of them had a story, right? But Gulnaz and Farida were the women who really were enthusiastically participating in the film. They really wanted to tell their stories. And we thought that they shone a light on the issue in different and interesting ways that could complement each other, right? I mean, Gulnaz was a little bit more of a traditional, young, somewhat meek woman who was raped and then gave birth on the prison floor. Farida was a little older, and she was powerful and strong and very opinionated. And, she actually ran away from her husband because she had fallen in love with another man, but only because her husband had abused her viciously for 10 years. So their stories complemented each other in different and interesting, unique ways. It turns out that Gulnaz, her meekness transformed into incredible strength, and Farida remained strong throughout. And both their stories are complex and complicated, and telling them with truth and integrity and honesty was our overriding goal. But I just want to say, that this idea of being enthusiastic participants in the storytelling is really important for documentary filmmakers. Part of the storyline of this film is the fact that the European Union, even though they gave us money to make the film in the beginning, tried to go in afterwards because they realized they shouldn't have given us money. And if they was going to shine a bad light on the prison system they funded, they tried to go in and tell the women, Gulnaz and Farida, to withdraw their consent to be in the film. And both Gulnaz and Farida said, no, we want to be in this film. We really want to be in this film. The only power that Gulnaz and Farida had in this situation was to use their voices. And so participating in the film was actually a form of empowerment for them. I mean, ultimately, there's only so much we as filmmakers can do, but what we can do is allow a space for people to tell their stories. And that's what they wanted to do. So that was the process we undertook when we found Gulnaz and Farida.
And this is a spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen the film, but Gulnaz, who really became ferocious and fierce, ultimately did not decide to go to, I guess it was Germany. The amazing lawyer Kim Motley was working with her. Talk about that and why you think she made that decision and what that decision was.
Yeah. So over the course of the film, Gulnaz, the woman who was raped by her uncle and had a baby on the prison floor, she had been pressured by her family and by the judge and by everyone to marry the man that raped her. And in Afghanistan, in Afghan culture, that is, in their eyes, in traditional tribal law, the only way you can regain your honor in society as a woman. And if she had done so, then the crime would have been wiped away and she would have been let out of prison. She didn't want to do it. She refused. And her rapist, her uncle, was in prison as well for raping her. He got 2 years in prison. She got 12 years for being raped. So over the course of the film, Kim Motley came to represent her and managed to get her out of prison because even though the judges in the justice system sentenced her in the Supreme Court, Kim put a petition together and got President Karzai to give her the first ever presidential pardon, and they released her from prison. But then she was languishing in this women's shelter, which was another prison altogether. Now imagine this woman, and she wasn't allowed to leave the women's shelter. And even then, the Attorney General of Afghanistan, even though Karzai gave her pardon, the Attorney General was coming into the shelter and saying, okay, now you got to marry your uncle. Even though they had commuted her sentence or pardoned her crime. So imagine this woman who grew up in her family's house. She doesn't really know how to read very well. Wasn't educated very well, very poor. And then she's living in a prison. Then she's living in a women's shelter. And she's always had walls around her, right? And Afghanistan, the society itself, is like a prison for her. So we really thought, not us, Kim Motley, her lawyer, who's an incredible force of nature, African-American lawyer who practiced in Afghanistan on women's rights and human rights cases, which, by the way, women's rights are human rights. Kim thought the only way for her to achieve real physical freedom was to leave the country. And Gulnaz really wanted to leave the country. The problem is that she wasn't allowed to leave the shelter because she didn't have an identity card. So she couldn't get a passport to actually get out of the country. And the only way to get an identity card is to have a male relative go with her to get the identity card and to escort her out of the country. And of course, her male relatives had all disowned her for the shame of her dishonor because she refused to marry the man who raped her. So you can see the issue that she was facing. And I don't really want to spoil the end of the film, but I will say this: she eventually did get out of the shelter, and not in the way that we had hoped that she would. But, going to Germany is almost like going to the moon. It's like, I don't know if that would have been better for her, honestly. And I can't make decisions for her. We can't make decisions for her. We can only, empower her to tell her story. So it's frustrating. But what we hope is that the story of Gulnaz and the story of Farida may shine a light on some of the things that are happening to these women, some of the challenges they face, some of the limits to their freedom in public space, political space in Afghanistan, so that the international community doesn't forget all of the thousands and hundreds of thousands now of other women who are oppressed under the Taliban, who cannot even go to school now. So hopefully their voices will help other women. Yeah.
This all happened under a much more quote unquote enlightened government. And now Taliban are back. Just extraordinary. One thing I did want to talk to you about in the film, it's a little bit of a spoiler alert. Farida's husband was kind of okay with, I guess, divorcing her, but had a price. Talk about that.
Yeah. So one of the things in the film that in any documentary film, we don't want to put ourselves in the story, right? But the edit for this film wasn't coming together at all. It doesn't make any sense. And so what we realized we had to do was actually explain the backstory of how all this unfolded. And of course, because we were there with our cameras was the reason that Gulnaz, the other woman, was able to speak to the press and became the face of international women's rights, pasted up on the front page of the New York Times. But Farida chose not to speak to the press. And Farida is the woman whose husband abused her for 10 years, and she ran away with a younger man. And the only way she could get out of prison, because she wasn't in the press and she didn't have all this international spotlight on her. Karzai didn't, come in and pardon her because it wasn't politically, fruitful for him. She was still languishing in the prison, and her crime was running away from her husband. Well, it was adultery, really, but it was really running away from her husband and disobeying him. So the court told her lawyer, Shakib, that if her husband chose to divorce her, then the crime would be basically wiped away because there is no crime anymore, right? So Shakib went up. We filmed Shakib going up to talk to her husband, and he demanded a price. And in Afghanistan, women are traded for money. Dowry is paid to the woman's family, and they're commodities sometimes. And so Farida was sold to her husband in the first place, and then he had sold two of his sisters to buy another wife after she had been imprisoned. So Shakib was up there saying, "Look, you have no claim on her anymore. Let her go." And Shakib said, "No, you owe me $100,000." 100,000 Afghani, which is about 2,000 US dollars. Farida didn't have the money. And so we're sitting there and we have a choice, right? We could keep our cameras rolling and, tell the story as it's unfolding and have Farida continue languishing in jail, which is perhaps, the documentary ethics thing to do, but it's not. There isn't really any choice there. We gave the money to Farida's husband so he could divorce her. And as soon as he did, Shakib went to the court, presented the divorce papers, and she was let out of prison. So that was the choice we did. But the important thing to know here is that we included that in the film. If we had done that and not explained what we did, then that would go against documentary ethics. But because we did that and then explained what we did in the film, I think it lets the audience understand, more about how the whole thing works, and also, what choices we face as filmmakers.
I think I remember when we spoke earlier, you said that it had taken you quite a while to actually translate the scene.
Yeah.
Eve and her husband. And so you, for what, years maybe even, didn't actually what he had said in that scene, which was kind of shocking. So, yeah.
There's an incredible scene in the film, that scene I just talked about, where Shakib goes to talk to Farida's husband, and he is trying to negotiate for him to divorce her. And, it's a long, like hours long conversation. And we had, Farzana was there translating, but not every word. And then, the upshot of it was he's demanding $2,000. And so we're like, okay, we had long discussions about that and decided to pay that money and included that in the film. But I hadn't translated the full conversation until years later. We ran out of money after we finished shooting the film because the European Union had sued us, and we were fighting this huge legal battle with them. And it was a long process for us. And we managed to raise more money to finish the edit, and then ran out of money again, and raised more money to get another editor on board, and ran out of money again, repeat. And I didn't translate that scene for years. And when I did, I just was like, what is happening here? Because the way Shakib negotiated with Ismail was just incredible. I mean, he apparently had a habit of buying young boys as prostitutes, which is a tradition in Afghanistan, called bachi. Um, and he was unfaithful to Farida, and he was abusive to her. He hit her a lot. He was denying this in the conversation, not very convincingly, but the conversation was just incredible. The fact that this was all coming out, and Shakib was doing such a great job of needling him and pointing out his flaws. That the scene, I think that's my favorite scene in the film, which is also a little behind the scenes uh dirt here, is that we had one camera on the production. And when you watch that scene, I don't think you'll believe me, because the way Clem shot the film, again, I work with incredible women, and it's not me, it's their film. I mean, I am here to support them. Clem shot the film with one camera, or that scene, and it looks like it was shot with two cameras. I mean, it's like back and forth and back and forth, and it's incredible. So it was really hard to edit, but I think it came out really well.
Mm-hmm. What was it like for you, having lived there and having done this film and the other films, when the U.S. finally withdrew and it was obvious that the Taliban were back?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing still to wrap our heads around, the fact that the Taliban are controlling Afghanistan again. And I think it's one of the biggest mistakes of the Biden administration, the way they withdrew. I lived, Clem lived, and Leslie lived, and obviously Farzana lived amongst the Afghan people. And I was running around filming every week with Afghans and telling stories of everyday Afghans. And I actually also made a film for the United States Senate about the Afghan National Army, and how, whether they were ready or not to take over once the Taliban, once we left. My assessment was no, absolutely not. But the film did authorize more funding for them. This was in 2018. It was just so obvious to me and to all my friends that if we left, the Taliban would take over. I mean, it wasn't even a question. And so when Biden made that decision, it was just an inevitable descent into chaos. And all my friends in Afghanistan, were trying to flee, and we were all trying to get people out. And it was, there's been a lot of stories told in the press about these heroic army people trying to get Afghans out. There's a lot of people who are civilians who did a lot more work and a lot more work over the years to try to help Afghans, survive and get out. I'm not saying I'm one of them. I'm not trying to say I'm a hero. I'm not. I did not do enough. The Afghans are the heroes. The Afghans who, spent 20 years struggling to fight for a better future, and also struggling for women's rights. Like, this film, With This Breath I Fly, is about two women in prison for moral crimes. It's one side of a larger complex story. Lots of my Afghan friends, men and women, are incredibly progressive and care deeply about arts and culture and women's rights and progressive societies and, just laws and, peace. And I think it's really important to understand that those are the people that fled the country when the Taliban took over. So that's, I think, what really makes me sad. There's so many people all over the world who are now adrift in a strange foreign land that are struggling with massive post-traumatic stress disorder from the 20 years of war that they had experienced. And all the money and material that we expended inside of Afghanistan is, I think, just absolutely wasted. I mean, we spent billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, and I don't know what we achieved. So it's really sad.
Sure. Have you had any contact with Farida or Gulnaz since the Taliban?
Yeah. Yeah, we have. We just were speaking with Farida's family this week. It's hard for them, obviously. Um, we are not going to show the film in Afghanistan now because the Taliban are in power, and we don't want to put the women in any danger at all. But we know that they want the film to be seen by the international community for sure. And so, it's our duty to honor the courage of their voices and get the film out there as widely as possible. They're safe right now. They've been, I guess the way I describe it is they've been wrapped back up into traditional tribal society. Farida is married to another man now. Gulnaz, again, I don't want to ruin the ending of the film, but she's okay. I mean, they're not ruffling feathers. But yeah, it's not easy right now, especially because it's just so poor. And the money that we as Americans and the international community was spending to support the Afghan government and, the police forces and the food distribution and farmers and everything like that, it's all gone. So people are starving in Afghanistan. It's a very hard life right now. But that said, yeah, we're in touch with them, and we want to honor the courage of their story, of them to appear in this film and get the film out there. Unfortunately, I will say it's very hard to get a film like this distributed inside of this country, inside of America. People care more about the Kardashians than they do about Gulnaz and Farida. So I think it's important for us to build a groundswell of interest in this film. I would like to announce here that we have very exciting recent news. Angelina Jolie has agreed to come on board the film as an executive producer, which is very exciting. She is an incredible voice for women's rights, and she cares deeply about the Afghan people. And hopefully we can do some sort of impact campaign to help women who are currently in Afghanistan now. But stay tuned.
Thank you. That is such good news. And thank you again for such a beautiful film and allowing us to showcase the film. And I know you've had a huge success in festivals around the country and around the world. So thank you very, very much. And thank your team.
Yeah. Clem and Leslie and also Pinar Toprak, our composer, one of the best composers in Hollywood, came on board to do the music. So thanks, Pinar. You're awesome.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. Good to see you.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen.